Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bridgehead. My name is Jonathon Van Maren, and today we'll be talking to somebody who has written one of the most discussed books of the year. Of course, if you're a history nerd, it's Dr. David J. Garrow. He's actually a Pulitzer Prize-winning American historian, and he's the author of the book Bearing the Cross, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That's the book that in 1987 won the Pulitzer Prize for biography. And his book is very, very interesting because he's essentially written the definitive biography, thus far at least, of President Barack Obama, both his life prior to the presidency and his presidency. And the book is interesting because essentially it turns on its head a number of the assumptions that people have had about the president and a lot of the narrative that Barack Obama himself has put forward. There's a couple of books that have come out recently on the Obama presidency that are giving people sort of an inside look on what actually went on as the Obama presidency sort of becomes history and people start to analyze it with a more critical and less political eye. Some of you will remember that about a month and a half ago, I actually interviewed Michael Weir, who wrote another book on the Obama presidency, and a book spoken quite positively of, I might mention, by Dr. David Garrow. So after I started to become familiar with this book and was going through the different revelations in it and starting to realize that here was a historical book that looked at Obama in a way that none of the previous books had. I actually have both of Obama's memoirs, and I was surprised to realize that a lot of the things that I had taken for granted were in fact not true. And so I fired Dr. David Garrow an email, and he was kind enough to agree to an interview. And I hope you all enjoy this conversation and find it as enlightening as I did. So first of all, why did you write this specific book? There's been a lot of biographies that have come out about Barack Obama in the past decade or so. There's, of course, his own two books, and yours runs quite a few more pages and has gotten a lot more buzz than the previous ones.
In early 2008, right at the beginning of the presidential campaign, when Barack Obama won the Iowa caucuses, I was frankly embarrassed that I knew nothing about him, given how much of my academic career has been focused on writing about race in the United States and particularly Martin Luther King. I did the standard biography of Dr. King some years ago, Bearing the Cross. Mm-hmm. So throughout that 2008 campaign, I read all the emerging biographical journalism about Obama's life. And the more I read, the more disappointed I got at how unthorough and incurious the journalists were, and particularly how everyone accepted Obama's 1995 memoir, Dreams from My Father, as a statement for the historical record rather than a heavily fictionalized mythification of his life. In early 2009, I went to Chicago for the first time and started interviewing the people who were his mentors during his community organizing years in Chicago in his mid-20s. And within a day or two, they pointed me towards a very nice lady who had incorporated their community groups, who had all her files from back then, including this long list of people typed by Barack himself, folks whom he was working with back then, whom the journalists had never discovered. And so that was the beginning of the slippery slope for me into doing this huge, long, comprehensive book that all told is based on more than 1,000 personal interviews.
I want to take a look at the one thing you just mentioned there, because it's probably been one of the most discussed aspects of your book. It's you referring to Dreams from My Father as historical fiction, essentially as a sort of a Alex Haley Roots sort of book, a politician's attempt to create the narrative. And the reason that's such an interesting point to make is because it not only sort of pricks the balloon of Obama's narrative, but it also, quite frankly, pricks the balloon of a lot of the right-wing narratives. For example, Dinesh D'Souza's books analyzing Obama were almost entirely based on short quotations from that book.
Very, very well stated. Dreams from My Father is fundamentally misleading and misinforming in multiple ways. Number one, it's a very calculated attempt by a young man who's about to start running for political office in Illinois to make his earlier life, during his high school years, during his college years, to make his life seem dramatically more black in retrospect than it actually was when he lived it. Obama in that book tries to present himself as this stereotypically unhappy, angry, black tough guy, actually calls himself a thug at one point.
Right.
And literally 100% of the people who knew him in high school, during his college years, without exception, reject that portrait. They recall a happy, easygoing, outgoing, friendly, smiling young man. And someone who, throughout those years, hadn't really yet been exposed at all to black America. Growing up in Hawaii, living briefly in Indonesia, having a whole set of Pakistani and international student buddies as his friendship network during college and after. So it's a book that actually gives people a fundamentally misleading sense of Obama's young life.
So what in your mind is the real narrative? Because as I pointed out, I find it very interesting that none of the narratives we've been presented about Barack Obama's life from himself and his supporters, and nor from his detractors, actually give us an accurate picture of him at all, which of course has made the criticism easier to slough off and has allowed his supporters to put forward his narrative all the more. What would you say the trajectory of the young Obama is? Because in some ways you're smashing myths on all sides.
Yes, exactly. The Barack Obama who moves to Chicago in 1985, 24 years old, everyone who knew Barack up through then thought he was a perfectly nice guy, but utterly unremarkable. Fast forward 3 years, after his 3 years in Chicago, when he starts Harvard Law School in 1988, everyone who meets him at Harvard thinks, voila, this is a remarkable, impressive young man whom we'll all be reading about in the future. So there is this profound self-transformation on Obama's part between 1985 and 1988, in part because he is for the first time immersed in a black urban community, comes to embrace his identity as an African American. Trying to do community organizing is very frustrating. And in contrast, there's the political example of Harold Washington, Chicago's first black mayor in those years, a hugely popular, incredibly outgoing, effervescent figure. And Barack makes the decision in 1987 that that's the future he wants for himself, to be a black political candidate.
Right. And when this narrative started to emerge, which narrative do you think that came out during his campaign was slightly accurate? Because you see a tug of war over the narrative, and you see neither narrative actually stating the truth, and then you have what you're putting forward. But what's most interesting is to try and ascertain whether or not Obama's narrative of a journey towards blackness was accurate but exaggerated, because he did struggle with it, but for a shorter amount of time on a smaller scale, or whether or not his books can essentially be seen as campaign autobiographies, which virtually every political candidate writes for the express purpose of controlling their own narrative.
Yes, exactly. At no point, whether in college, whether in his private life in Chicago, during his organizing years, during his time at Harvard Law School, even when he gets down to the Illinois State Legislature in Springfield in the late 1990s, at none of those times is Barack sitting at the black table in the cafeteria, to use a well-known U.S. metaphor.
Right.
Barack's identification as black gains a lot of strength in those community organizing years, but his closest friends, time and again, aren't from an African-American background. The woman with whom he lived in Chicago during the community organizing years, Sheila Yeager, half Dutch, half Japanese. They had a very intense relationship that lasted almost 5 years. Barack's closest friend, very close friend in law school, Rob Fisher, slightly older white economist. They wrote an unpublished book manuscript together, a fascinating document, about 250 pages. It's a great roadmap to Barack's thinking about how he believes politics rather than litigation is where African American efforts need to be focused.
Now, that's an interesting point, Barack Obama's thinking, because he was very good at portraying himself during the campaign as a figure upon which everyone could project their hopes and dreams, sometimes in those words. And then, of course, others said he was a radical progressive, a hardcore left-winger. From the people that you spoke to and interviewed, what would you say his politics were? Did he make himself out, for example, to be far more conservative than he actually was?
It might be a little harsh as a label, but I think a faux progressive would be what many people in Chicago and Illinois would accept as a label. During his first 7 or 8 years in Illinois politics, Barack is very strongly in favor of single-payer universal health care coverage, and his number one issue of all is attacking big money in politics and calling for very thoroughgoing campaign reform and finance reform. At the beginning, he endorses gay marriage, and then very quickly backs off it. Somewhat similarly, in the wake of 9/11, he's for several years a very tough critic of the intelligence community and the Patriot Act and the whole Bush national security agenda. But come 2008, the Obama we first see as a presidential candidate is a much more tentative, hesitant, cautious figure. And once he's in the White House, particularly on the national security issue, he ends up becoming essentially a continuation of the Bush administration's intelligence policies.
When you look at some of the things you mentioned, because there was a book recently written by Michael Weir, who was an Obama aide in the White House. Yes, and then there was David Axelrod's book, and they both take a very different point of view on what Obama's position on gay marriage would have been. And what I get the sense of, and you can tell me if I'm right or if I'm wrong, is somebody who, as you can tell by his previous memoirs, is almost paralyzed by the idea of his legacy and how he comes across, and that perhaps contributed to some of the flip-flops and the hesitancy we see?
Yes. The Michael Weir book, though it's gotten very little attention in the United States, is a very important, critical insight by someone who worked for the Obama presidency. With gay marriage, Barack's personal preference, I think, is very clear back in 1995, 1996, that he thinks this is a basic civil rights issue. But then political calculation trumps that position, and he, remains scared to embrace or articulate his real belief until Joe Biden pushes the envelope during the second term, and that's a decision where the very short little Michael Weir book is I think, a very devastating comment. But Axelrod, as Obama's political guru, within the context of Chicago and Illinois, the progressives who wanted Barack to be their champion always, I think, in my judgment, correctly viewed Axelrod as a sort of organization apparatchik, And so Axelrod and Obama again and again chose political calculation over any true policy belief or commitment.
Now, one of the things that your book has both gotten a lot of attention for and a lot of criticism for is your examination of Barack Obama's personal life. I believe in one interview it was worded as Obama's hedonism. What do you think that side of him tells us about Barack Obama? Because you've essentially said you've included the details of his various sexual relationships with people, his drug use, etc., because it tells us fundamentally something about Obama's trajectory and who he was.
I think hedonism would be a very inaccurate word for Obama. There's a lot of marijuana use during high school and college. There's a considerable amount of cocaine usage up through age 24, age 25. Before his marriage to Michelle Robinson, Barack had 3 meaningful girlfriends, 2 of whom, Genevieve Cook in New York and then Sheila Yeager in Chicago, were very serious, intense relationships. But by the standards of any young man in America in the 1980s, I think Barack's personal life is very much in the middle of the distribution. I don't think it should come as a surprise to anyone that a young man who's 26 years old could have an intense relationship where they're talking very seriously about getting married.
Right. And what in your opinion, are some of the main faults that people on each side have made in regards to judging him? So starting with the right-wing side, you've got the books written by Dinesh D'Souza. You have the accusations of Barack Obama, so-called palling around with terrorists, I think Sarah Palin put it. What are the main things that they all got wrong?
The notion that Barack was ever any sort of a closet political radical couldn't be further from the truth. This was someone who was so interested in finding the center of the room, so to speak, that whatever would be in his political self-interest would always trump any actual commitment. And the notion that Bill Ayers, who was a social friend in the Hyde Park neighborhood in Chicago, someone whom Barack and Michelle had dinner with dozens of times, the notion that Ayers had any political influence on Barack is, I think, entirely notional, even though the Obamas did pretty successfully cover up how close a social relationship Ayers and Obama did have.
And how about the left? What are the main things they got wrong about the Obama narrative?
With people on the American left like Cornel West, for example, I think their critique of Obama from pretty early on was right on target. They realized that this was someone who publicly identified as black, but who was not ever going to go to the mat for the black community or black interests. I think a lot of people correctly appreciated, just how cautious and limited a figure Obama was as a politician.
And when you were researching this book, what were some things that really stood out to you and you thought, well, the American people really need to know this in order to understand these 8 years of the Obama presidency?
I think it's remarkable that someone could write a memoir of his life, published in 1995, and make no reference whatsoever to these 2 crucial relationships with Genevieve Cook and Sheila Yeager that he had back in the really formative time in his life. But from really the beginning of law school forward, Barack was always, in every decision, joining Trinity United Church of Christ as a good example, was always calculating towards what would best help him in a political career. That's the insight that so many people on the right and on the left failed to fully appreciate.
The interesting thing about your point about Trinity Church is, of course, his association, whatever that would have been, with Richard Wright ended up briefly
Jeremiah Wright.
Yeah, it ended up briefly hurting him during the political campaign. Is it true in your estimation that Barack Obama joined a church, somebody who had been previously very irreligious, simply to further his political career and his community organizing, or was this something that he found himself drawn to on a more spiritual level, if you will?
Of all the hundreds and hundreds of people I interviewed who have known Barack across the years, literally 99% of them believe that Barack was never a deeply religious person. Trinity Church was the perfect church to be in if you were a sort of upwardly mobile, civically interested, racially identified young black couple in Chicago.
And I know, because it says in your book, that you actually allowed Barack Obama to read most of what you'd written and that he argued with you quite vehemently on a few of the points. Is there anything you're allowed to tell us about those conversations?
Yes. Last year, 2016, I spent a total of 8 hours at the White House with President Obama. A first conversation that lasted maybe an hour 20 in the Oval Office. Primarily about his personal relationships in the 1980s. And I made the decision after that it was just the appropriate, fair, human thing to let this living person read this long manuscript. And I was very honored, frankly, that the sitting president took dozens of hours to read through this huge manuscript. And we had two subsequent long 3-hour plus meetings in the White House in October and then again in December 2016, where he went through the manuscript, turning the pages page by page by page, stopping where he had marked up something. Now, under the weird rules of Washington, those conversations, were off the record.
Right.
I take very good notes, so I'm not supposed to quote him.
Mm-hmm.
He said many very positive things about the book manuscript, but there indeed are a number of my conclusions and interpretations and perspectives that he very unsurprisingly doesn't like and doesn't agree with.
Has he reacted at all since the book has been officially published?
No, I've not seen any public comment at all from him, and I believe he's, as in Canada you very well know, he's primarily been traveling the globe since he left the White House, whether the South Pacific or Europe or there with your Prime Minister, so I don't know whether he's had the chance to go back and look at it again or not.
Well, we'll be encouraging all of our listeners to buy and read the book, and we thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you so much.